I would like to think that I am improved as an entertainer, and I like to get the rapport with an audience, because it's a give and take thing. If you can do that, it works.
They called him the King, a voice that shook the world, a swagger that redefined cool. But behind Elvis Presley's polished image and polite interviews, there were certain artists and entire bands that rubbed him the wrong way. Some for how they looked, others for what they stood for. And one, he considered a threat to America itself. This isn't about petty rivalries or chart competition. This is deeper, messier. And it starts with a meeting in Bel-Air that changed everything, even if no one knew it at the time. Number 6. The Beatles. In the 1960s, there were two forces shaping music around the world. One was Elvis Presley, the King, the original icon. The other was a little band from Liverpool called the Beatles. To fans, it looked like two worlds colliding, a handoff between generations, rock's past meeting its future. But behind closed doors, Elvis wasn't celebrating the British invasion. In fact, he saw it as a warning sign. This isn't just about musical taste. This was a cultural and ideological clash, one that went way beyond guitars and hairstyles. It all started back in 1965 when Elvis met the Beatles at his house in Bel-Air. The Fab Four were nervous. This was the man they'd all worshipped growing up. John Lennon once said Elvis made him want to be a rock star. Paul McCartney called the meeting like meeting a god. But for Elvis, it wasn't worship. It was business. He met them, sure, smiled, cracked a few jokes, played some music. But everyone in the room could feel it. The chemistry was off. It was cordial, not warm, respectful, not friendly. The meeting was awkward, and once it was over, Elvis never invited them back. In public, nothing seemed wrong, but privately, Elvis had serious concerns. He saw the Beatles as a threat, not to his fame, but to American culture. You have to remember who Elvis was by the mid-60s. He wasn't just a singer. He was a symbol of patriotism, discipline, the military, Southern values, and respect for tradition. He wore the badge of America's golden boy, even after the scandals, the hips, the fame. The Beatles? They were the exact opposite. They sang about illegal substances, spiritual awakening, anti-war politics. They were growing out their hair, questioning religion, promoting peace during wartime. To Elvis, that wasn't cool. That was dangerous. And then it went further. In 1970, Elvis took a private plane to Washington, D.C. He requested a meeting with President Richard Nixon, saying he wanted to help the country. And during that now famous sit-down, Elvis didn't hold back. He told Nixon the country was in trouble, that the youth were being led astray by anti-American influences. And at the top of that list? The Beatles. He said, point blank, that they were encouraging illegal substance use, rebellion, and a breakdown of moral values. Think about that for a second. The king of rock and roll walked into the White House and asked to be made a federal agent. Why? So he could fight the very counterculture movement the Beatles helped create. That's not just a feud. That's a mission. And while Elvis never directly attacked them in interviews, those close to him knew the truth. He didn't just dislike their sound. He was afraid of what they represented, especially John Lennon. Lennon had become increasingly political in the late 60s. He criticized the Vietnam War, promoted socialist ideas, and made headlines when he said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. That line alone sent shockwaves through the American South, and Elvis didn't forget it. He reportedly called Lennon anti-American and privately urged authorities to monitor him. He felt Lennon's message was corrupting the youth, dividing the country, and turning music into a tool for political rebellion. And for a man like Elvis, who had served in the military, who had always tried to walk the line between rebel and role model, that was unforgivable. It's ironic, really, because when the Beatles met Elvis in '65, they were like kids meeting their hero. But by the end of the decade, the King saw them less like fans and more like enemies of the state. Years later, when asked about Elvis, Paul McCartney was still respectful. He said Elvis changed everything. But the bond? It never really formed. They were just too different. Elvis, the embodiment of the 1950s dream, all slick hair and Southern charm. The Beatles, the voice of the 1960s revolution, wild hair, wild ideas, and no interest in looking back. What could have been a historic friendship turned into a quiet, lasting distance. Not because of ego, not because of talent, but because of values. Elvis may have smiled in that Bel-Air living room, but deep down he knew these weren't his people, and he'd never let them be. That might have been shocking, but the next one rewrites the whole story. Number 5, Bob Dylan. And yes, we know he's not a band. But when we're talking about music legends Elvis Presley had issues with, Bob Dylan more than earns his spot on this list. To the world, Bob Dylan was a genius, a poet, a prophet, a rebel with a harmonica. But to Elvis Presley, he was confusing. This wasn't some fiery feud or screaming match backstage. It was something quieter, more subtle, but just as real and just as personal. Elvis admired a lot of things about Dylan: the lyrics, the storytelling, the weight of the words. He once called "Tomorrow Is a Long Time" one of the most beautiful songs he'd ever heard, and even recorded a cover of it in 1966. But here's the thing, he never released it as a single. It sat quietly on an album few people even noticed. No interviews, no fanfare, just a whisper of a tribute from one legend to another. Because, as much as Elvis respected Dylan's pen, he never really embraced what Dylan represented. It started with the sound. That voice, raw, nasal, almost sarcastic, was everything Elvis wasn't. Where Elvis crooned with soul and velvet, Dylan sang like a man daring you to listen. And then there was the look. While Elvis was still rocking custom-made suits, clean hair, and showbiz polish, Dylan showed up in second-hand jackets, wild curls, and don't-care shades. They were two different visions of what a musician could be. And for Elvis, who had built his career on control, performance, and crowd-pleasing charm, Dylan's whole vibe felt reckless, maybe even arrogant. The folk movement? Elvis didn't get it. Not really. It wasn't that he hated it, but it was so rooted in protest, in rebellion, in challenging the very system Elvis had come to represent. Dylan was marching in civil rights rallies. He was singing about war, race, injustice, topics Elvis rarely touched in his music. And that created distance. Because deep down, Elvis knew he was no longer the voice of rebellion. That torch had passed, and it passed to guys like Dylan. To fans, Dylan was the new Elvis. To Elvis, Dylan was a reminder of how fast the world was changing and how easily the crown could slip. And then came 1965. Dylan went electric. Guitars screamed, folk purists booed, and rock critics declared, "The game has changed." Elvis watched it happen from the sidelines. His film career was on life support. His music was trapped in formula. And here came Dylan, blowing up genres and being hailed as the voice of a generation. It wasn't jealousy, it was disconnection. Elvis didn't speak Dylan's language, musically or politically, and he wasn't alone. A lot of older artists didn't get it. But for Elvis, the discomfort was deeper. Because Dylan wasn't just changing music, he was changing the rules. No stage moves, no fancy outfits, just lyrics, message, and raw energy. It was everything Elvis had never been. And maybe, part of him knew, it was everything he couldn't be. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, that Elvis once asked a studio musician, "Why does he sing like that? Can't he hear himself?" A joke, maybe, but behind it, frustration, confusion, maybe even insecurity. Because as Dylan's influence grew, Elvis's grip on the culture started to slip. They never performed together, never shared a stage, never collaborated. But Dylan's presence was always there, like a shadow. The silent competition Elvis never really entered, but could never quite ignore. Years later, Dylan would reflect on Elvis with reverence. He called him the embodiment of rock and roll. He said hearing Elvis for the first time felt like breaking out of jail. So maybe there was mutual respect after all. But they were ships, passing in the night, headed in opposite directions. One was rising from protest songs and basement tapes. The other was fighting to stay relevant from inside the gates of Graceland. In the end, Elvis only ever recorded that one Dylan song. No duets, no covers after the 60s. Just one track quietly tucked away, like a private nod from one artist to another. A nod that said, "I hear you, I respect you, but I'll never be you." And maybe that's what this entry is really about. Not hate, not rivalry, but that uncomfortable space between admiration and alienation, between the king of rock and roll and the man who made royalty feel like a relic. Number 4, The Doors. This one's not a feud in the traditional sense, but when it comes to the bands that pushed Elvis Presley's buttons the wrong way, The Doors belong on this list, even if the tension was mostly one-sided. By the late 1960s, rock and roll was no longer polite. It wasn't about tuxedos and TV variety shows. It was about rebellion, chaos, and stage lights that felt more like fire than spotlight. And no one embodied that new kind of energy more than Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors, the Lizard King, a poet, a provocateur, a man who made it his mission to blur the line between concert and catastrophe. But if Morrison was the wild future of rock, then Elvis? He was the foundation, the original flame that lit the fuse. And he didn't like what he saw it turning into. Elvis and Morrison never met face to face. But Elvis definitely knew who Jim was, and he didn't approve. It wasn't just the music, though The Doors' psychedelic sound and eerie organs were a far cry from the rhythm and blues roots Elvis loved. It was the performance. Morrison didn't just perform, he unraveled. He screamed. He collapsed. He stripped on stage. Sometimes he showed up drunk. Sometimes he didn't show up at all. He was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and, in Elvis's eyes, unprofessional. To Elvis, being a performer meant commanding the room. You stood tall. You worked the crowd. You honored the ticket price. You brought grace to the madness. Morrison, he brought more madness. There's a famous story. Morrison allegedly exposed himself during a concert in Miami in 1969. The entire music world buzzed. He was arrested, charged with lewd behavior, and banned from several venues. And while many young fans saw it as rebellion, Elvis saw it as disgrace. Insiders say Elvis was appalled by Morrison's antics, calling them embarrassing and a stain on what rock and roll was supposed to be. And here's the twist. Jim Morrison idolized Elvis. He grew up listening to Heartbreak Hotel on loop. He once said Elvis was the reason he wanted to sing. You can even hear it in Morrison's voice. That deep baritone, the swagger, the southern growl. It was a tribute, whether he admitted it or not. But that love? It wasn't mutual. Elvis didn't hear homage. He heard noise. He didn't see a disciple. He saw a loose cannon. And as the cultural tides shifted, Elvis found himself watching guys like Morrison redefine what it meant to be a rock star. And he didn't like where it was going. Because here's the deeper layer. Elvis had spent years trying to clean up his image. He'd done his time in the army. He'd survived scandal, softened his hips, and polished his act for family-friendly TV. And now, here was this barefoot hurricane in leather pants, undoing all of it with a single scream. For Elvis, the Doors were a symbol, not just of new music, but of lost control, of a world where performers didn't follow the rules anymore. And to a guy who built his career inside those rules, that wasn't innovation. That was disrespect. The clash wasn't loud or public. No headlines, no interviews, just quiet judgment and mutual distance. There's no record of Elvis ever playing a Doors song or even referencing them in any real artistic way. And Morrison, despite his love for Elvis, never pushed to meet him. Maybe he knew it wouldn't go well. Maybe the Lizard King wasn't ready to meet the real king. Years later, fans would draw comparisons. Two icons of different eras, both magnetic, both mysterious, both gone too soon. But in their lifetimes, they were planets orbiting two different suns. Elvis wanted structure. Morrison wanted to burn it down. Elvis wanted harmony. Morrison wanted heat. Elvis represented the birth of rock. Morrison, maybe, its funeral. And that's the tragedy here. Because this wasn't a feud born of jealousy or competition. It was born of conflict between two visions of music, one rooted in performance and grace, the other in raw, unfiltered chaos. To Elvis, Jim Morrison was a warning sign, a flashing red light at the edge of a cultural cliff. And when Morrison died in 1971, just 27 years old, Elvis didn't comment publicly. But those around him say it rattled him. Not because of who Morrison was, but because of what he represented. How quickly the fire could burn too hot. How fast a legend could lose control. So no, Elvis didn't feud with the Doors. But he saw them clearly. He saw the storm. And he wanted no part of it. You might want to pause and breathe. This one's raw. Number 3. Led Zeppelin. We know Led Zeppelin isn't the type of band Elvis Presley would have beefed with in the tabloid sense. There was no screaming match or walk-off stage moment. But when two titans of music meet and clash behind the scenes, it's worth talking about. Especially when one of them is the king. By the early 1970s, Led Zeppelin was unstoppable. Jimmy Page on guitar, Robert Plant on vocals. Together, they were turning up the volume on rock and roll and never looking back. They were loud. They were legendary. And in just a few short years, they'd gone from playing small clubs to selling out arenas worldwide. And somewhere in Memphis, Elvis Presley noticed. He didn't blast their albums. He didn't ask them to open for him. But he knew who they were. Because by then, everyone did. The day they finally met wasn't planned to be historic. Just another backstage moment in Las Vegas, where Elvis had returned to the stage and was reclaiming his crown in a sparkling white jumpsuit. Led Zeppelin, fans of the King since childhood, were starstruck. Jimmy Page later said that meeting Elvis felt like walking into the presence of royalty. Robert Plant could barely get a word out. These were rock gods, standing in front of the original god. But if the Zeppelin guys were nervous, Elvis was casual, cool. He shook their hands, cracked a few jokes, and then dropped a line that's gone down in rock folklore. "You guys make it hard for me to sleep with all that noise." It was a joke, kind of. He smiled when he said it, but the message behind it was real. Because here's the truth. Elvis didn't connect with Led Zeppelin's sound. It wasn't personal. He respected the success. He admired the dedication. But the volume, the distortion, the chaotic energy, it just wasn't his thing. Elvis came from a world of blues, gospel, and clean-cut showmanship. He believed in melody, precision, and presence. Zeppelin brought noise, mystery, and long, wild guitar solos that seemed to erupt from another planet. To Elvis, it sounded like the genre he helped create had gone off the rails. And let's not forget, by the time Zeppelin was climbing the charts, Elvis was fighting to stay relevant. He wasn't the young rebel anymore. He was doing Vegas residencies, filming TV specials, trying to find his place in a world that now worshipped bands like the one standing right in front of him. Still, he was gracious. The meeting ended with a laugh, a few photos, and Elvis even telling the band he'd seen Stairway to Heaven was a hit. He didn't hate them. He just didn't understand what the big deal was. But behind the scenes, the divide was clear. Led Zeppelin saw Elvis as a founding father, someone who made their careers possible. But Elvis saw them as something else entirely, a symbol of how far rock had drifted from its roots. He never played a Zeppelin song in concert, never covered their work, and according to those close to him, he rarely listened to any of it. He didn't criticize them publicly. That wasn't his style. But privately, he'd raise an eyebrow at the ear-splitting guitars, the illegal substance-fueled mystique, and the wild man stage behavior that Zeppelin had made famous. To Elvis, this wasn't performance, it was noise. There's a story, half legend, half confirmed, that Elvis once told his band, "You don't need a wall of amps to fill a room, just give them a reason to listen." That was his philosophy, Zeppelin's philosophy. Blow the roof off and let the dust settle later. Two icons, two generations, both legends, but never truly aligned. Years later, Robert Plant would still speak glowingly of that short meeting with Elvis, calling it one of the greatest moments of his life. He meant it, because for Zeppelin, Elvis Presley was the spark that lit the match. But for Elvis, Zeppelin was the wildfire that came after, thrilling, uncontrollable, and not quite his scene. They weren't enemies, but they were never allies. Sometimes, respect doesn't equal connection. And even in a room full of legends, not every conversation turns into a collaboration. Elvis smiled. He shook their hands. He cracked a joke about the noise. And then, he walked away. Number 2. Elton John. By the late 1970s, Elton John was everywhere. Sequined capes, neon feathers, giant sunglasses the size of dinner plates. He didn't just perform, he exploded onto the stage. He was glam. He was glitter. He was everything Elvis wasn't. And Elvis noticed. Backstage, in private circles, people say Elvis would laugh quietly when Elton's name came up. Not cruelly, not jealously, just that kind of half-scoff, half-shrug you give when you see something that doesn't make sense anymore. He reportedly called Elton that guy with the funny glasses, a throwaway line, but one that stuck. Because for Elvis, the glam rock movement wasn't music, it was theater, and not the good kind. He'd built his empire on cool, slick hair, smooth moves. A voice that melted crowds without needing a wardrobe change. He could hypnotize a stadium with just a mic, a spotlight, and a gold lame jacket. Elton? He wore platform boots, feather boas, and sometimes even wings. To Elvis, it looked like a circus. By that time, Elvis was in a very different phase of his life. The jumpsuits had gotten tighter. The concerts were starting to feel like rituals, routine, bloated, weighed down by pills and pressure. But still, he saw himself as the standard. And when he looked at Elton, he didn't see a successor. He saw a gimmick. What he didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, was that Elton adored him. From the very beginning, Elton John had worshipped Elvis Presley. He studied his music, watched his films, mimicked his swagger as a teenager playing piano in local pubs. Elton once said seeing Elvis in the 1950s was like witnessing a god step on stage. He meant it. And when they finally met backstage in the 70s, Elton was excited, nervous even. But Elvis, by then, wasn't himself. The sparkle in his eyes was fading. The energy was heavy. The meeting was brief, polite, distant. Elton left heartbroken, not because Elvis insulted him, but because the man he'd worshipped had become a shadow. He later said that seeing Elvis in his final years was one of the saddest things I've ever witnessed. A king still wearing the crown, but clearly losing the kingdom. And that's what makes this entry different from the others. There was no political divide like with the Beatles, no artistic clash like with Dylan, no performance disgust like with Jim Morrison. This was something more subtle, a generational disconnect. Elvis couldn't understand what glam rock was trying to do. He didn't see it as an evolution. He saw it as decoration, without depth. He didn't get the wild costumes, the stage pianos shaped like giant glasses, or the idea of making yourself the spectacle. He thought the music should do the talking. Elton thought the show was part of the message. And that made all the difference. There's a photo, now iconic, of Elton John visiting Elvis's grave in Memphis. He stands quietly in front of the stone, no entourage, no spotlight, just a man paying tribute to the ghost of someone who shaped his life. That moment says everything, because even though Elvis never truly accepted Elton, Elton never stopped loving Elvis. Not the tired, bloated Elvis of the end, but the wild, revolutionary Elvis who lit the fuse under rock and roll. In some ways, Elton picked up where Elvis left off. He carried the spirit of spectacle forward, but wrapped it in glitter and flamboyance instead of gospel and grease. And whether Elvis saw it or not, that spirit was still there. A little louder, a little flashier, but still pulsing with the same electricity that once made girls scream and stadiums shake. So no, this wasn't a feud. There were no fists, no insults, no headlines, just a quiet judgment from one legend and a lingering heartbreak from another. Because sometimes the greatest divide in music isn't about talent, it's about how you wear it. And Elvis, he wore the crown. Elton, he wore the crown, and a feathered cape to match. You made it this far, now get ready for a feud that will blow your mind. Number 1. The Rolling Stones. When it comes to bands Elvis Presley quietly disapproved of, the Rolling Stones were near the top of that list. The tension was never loud, but it was real, and it ran deep. By the late 1960s, rock and roll had gotten a new face, and it had pouty lips, swinging hips, and a Union Jack swagger. That face belonged to Mick Jagger, and his band, the Rolling Stones, were rewriting the rules. They weren't trying to be polished. They weren't trying to be polite. They were wild. defiant and proud of it. To a new generation, they were the truth. But to Elvis Presley, they were a problem. Elvis never said much publicly about the Stones. No trash talk in interviews, no diss tracks. That wasn't his style. But behind closed doors, he didn't hide his feelings. He thought their image was loud, messy, and borderline obscene. And when he watched Mick Jagger slither across the stage, grinding and strutting with reckless confidence, Elvis wasn't impressed. He was appalled. Elvis had made a career out of moves that once shocked the nation. The hip shake on the Ed Sullivan Show, the curled lip, the smooth, calculated seduction. But there was a difference. To Elvis, his movements were stylized, part of a performance. What Jagger was doing, that wasn't style. That was chaos. "He moves like a rooster on fire," Elvis once joked to a bandmate. Again, he smiled when he said it. But underneath the joke was a judgment. Because here's what really bothered Elvis. The Stones weren't just redefining the music. They were breaking all the rules he'd spent years trying to work within. Elvis had served in the military. He'd tried to be respectable, even when it went against his instincts. He'd navigated Hollywood, television censors, and conservative America, all while walking a tightrope between rebel and role model. The Stones? They lit that tightrope on fire and danced across the ashes. Illegal substances arrests, banned performances, songs that practically dared the FCC to intervene. Where Elvis once faced backlash for wiggling his hips, the Rolling Stones were openly singing about sleeping with groupies and fighting the system, and somehow getting away with it. It wasn't just about content. It was about control. Elvis believed in owning the stage, being sharp, polished, powerful. Mick Jagger's on-stage presence? It was loose, wild, even feminine. To Elvis, it looked like a mockery of showmanship. He didn't hate Jagger personally. They met once, briefly, and it was civil. But Elvis kept his distance. There were no collaborations, no compliments, no nods of approval. And if you looked closely, the disapproval ran both ways. Jagger, in his own words, never quite connected with Elvis's later years. He said the Vegas jumpsuits, the karate moves, the excess, it all felt like a man trapped in his own image. To Jagger, Elvis was a ghost of a past era. To Elvis, Jagger was a warning of where the future was headed. But here's the irony. In their own ways, both men defined rebellion. Elvis was the first, the original icon who shattered 1950s purity with a smile and a snarl. Jagger was the next wave, pushing it further, stripping it down, and adding a layer of dirty glamour. Two different styles, same revolution. But Elvis didn't see it that way. To him, Jagger was the fallout, not the legacy. And while he never attacked the Stones directly, those close to him knew he didn't play their music, didn't praise their work. And he certainly didn't admire their image. Because to Elvis, the Rolling Stones represented something dangerous. Rock and roll without rules. And Elvis? He had spent his whole life learning to play within them, even when it hurt. Years later, Jagger would reflect on Elvis with a strange mix of admiration and distance. Because their relationship wasn't built on friendship or rivalry. It was built on difference, different styles, different eras, different codes. And that's why, even in a world where music was constantly evolving, Elvis kept his stance. The Stones could have the stage. He just didn't want to stand on it with them. For all his fame, Elvis Presley wasn't a man of feuds. He rarely spoke ill of anyone on the record. But behind the curtain, there was a different story, one of quiet judgments, clashing values, and a music world that kept changing faster than he could keep up. These weren't just names on a list. They were symbols. Each one chipped away at the foundation he helped build, until the king of rock and roll found himself ruling a kingdom he barely recognized. Some saw him as a hero, others as a relic. But one thing's for sure, he never stopped watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more. And when you're ready, click on the next video. There's a lot more where this came from.